Good evening, everyone, and welcome to your first AP United States History video lecture on progressivism. Because I am putting this up late, I told you guys that your notes would be due for tomorrow, Wednesday, but they'll be due for Friday. Just make sure that you have them in your notebook, and on Wednesday, tomorrow, we're going to start World War I. But for today's lesson, we're going to focus on progressivism. And I remember last time, right before we left class, we were talking about what it meant to be progressive and what that word meant. So if you remember, or if you need to take the chance to look it up on Google, to be progressive simply means to do something different than what was done before. And so the reformers during this time period of progressivism are really just going to be looking at the ills of the Second Industrial Revolution. So we had big business come up. We have railroads, we have monopolies, and we have all these great things. But what the progressives are going to look at now are the issues, the ills, the troubles that were caused by the rise of big business. So if you look at that second slide, and it says the main idea of progressivism. And progressive focused on three areas of reform. Easing the suffering of the urban poor, so the way they live, right? We talk about tenement housing, how landlords would pack all these people into one block, sometimes had no windows. So one of the things, just foreshadowing, we're going to look at the Tenement Act, where a lot of those laws are made unconstitutional. You can't do that. We're also going to look at improving unfair and dangerous working conditions. And we're also going to look at reforming government. One of the ones that becomes pretty important is directly electing your state senator. So the first one that we're going to look at, we're on slide number 3, is progressivism and its champions. And the first thing that I want to say is, if you're going through these slides, the only thing that I want you to copy down are what's in red. So we see here that, of course, we have industrialization, and it's great. It lowers the standards of living. People are able to afford more things. But at the same time, there's so many dangerous issues. And the champions of progressivism are the people who exposed what those issues were. And for example, these champions, for the journalists at least, they're called muckrakers because they would rake up all the muck. They would expose the muck of the industrialists. So we have 3 that we're focusing on. First, we have Jacob Riis. He was a Danish immigrant who faced poverty in New York, and he exposed the slums through magazines, photographs, and a best-selling book. We also have Ida Tarbell, who exposed the corruption of the Standard Oil Company and its owner, John D. Rockefeller. Lincoln Stevens, he wrote Shame of the Cities, and he exposed corrupt city governments. These muckrakers did a lot of great work to show what was happening. And again, we talk about how we take for granted that at this time period, information doesn't travel as quickly as it does now. So what these journalists were doing was really sharing this information all across the country. We also talk about reforming society on slide number 4. You see what's in red. The Tenement Act of 1901. It forced landlords to install lighting in public hallways and to provide at least 1 toilet for every 2 families. Sounds crazy to you, but this was real at this time period. It helped outhouses in New York become obsolete. We have 2 organizations that come up in the fight for civil rights. First, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, fighting to fight prejudice in society, right? So we don't only have prejudice against immigrants in the cities, but we still have, of course, segregation and prejudice against African Americans in the North and in the South. So the NAACP, it's an organization that's very strongly tied to W.B. Du Bois. They rejected Booker T. Washington's ideas of assimilation. And they also protested against the extremely racist movie, The Birth of a Nation. I don't want to tell you exactly what The Birth of a Nation is about, but you should YouTube it, and you can see how racist it is. The Anti-Defamation League, it was formed by Sigmund Livingston, who was a Jewish man in Chicago in 1913, and he fought anti-Semitism, which is hatred or dislike against Jewish people. So now we're going to transition into reforming the workplace. We're going to see that, aside from the fact that there are unfair working conditions, it usually takes a big event or some type of disaster for people to really pay attention to what's going on. So there were people like Florence Kelley who helped push the Illinois legislature to protect child labor laws and to limit women's working hours. Eventually, the states did pass some child labor laws, and we're going to look more specifically at what the work days look like in different settings. 3 Supreme Court cases that dealt with these labor laws. We should know basically what they're about. Lochner versus New York. The court refused to uphold the law limiting bakers to a 10-hour workday. In Miller versus Oregon, the court upheld a state law that establishes a 10-hour workday for women in laundries and factories. And Bunting versus Oregon, Brandeis's case, or the Brandeis's brief, as his defense was called, became a model for similar cases. It was a case that led the court to uphold the law that extended the protection of a 10-hour workday for men working in mills and factories. Again, we don't really get national attention until a disaster occurs. And that happened in the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire, where in 1911, a gruesome disaster in New York inspired progressives to fight for safety in the workplace. There were 500 women that worked in this factory, and 140 women and men died in the fire, mostly because the owners of these factories would keep their factories locked so that workers wouldn't leave. In the case of a fire, your workers can't leave. What happens? They die. So, just as they were ending their 6-day work week, a small firework broke out, and it quickly spread to the 3 floors. This really got people to focus on this, and laws started being passed in New York, and it became a model for workplace safety worldwide. I did mention election reforms, and one of the main ones, this comes out of the populist movement, because people in the West wanted to directly elect their senators because those senators in turn would fight for their rights. However, when you're not directly electing your senators, the people who are close to you are not talking about the things that are specific to your community. So we get the 17th Amendment, which allows voters to elect their senators directly. This is a great populist win. Women at the time also try to institute a ban on prohibition. We talk about what's going on in the urban slums, and you think about, the people that are working in these factories, especially when you're poor and broke, alcoholism usually spreads. And women, especially the Women's Christian Temperance Union, headed by Frances Willard, they really felt like alcoholism was at the root of a lot of our nation's problems. They eventually try to pass the 18th Amendment. Eventually it does get passed. We know that there's prohibition during the Roaring Twenties, which comes up right after World War I. Prohibition gets banned. Alcohol becomes free to consume again. To quickly touch upon civil rights, aside from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, we also have to understand that in this time period, people are fighting for reform and are fighting for rights, but the rights of women are still undermined. So, women are not allowed to be a part of reform groups. They're not accepted. So African American women, they formed their own reform group, the National Association for Colored Women. We also have organizations that led the women's suffrage movement, right? Again, there's so much going on in terms of progressivism, in terms of farmers. We have women, we have African Americans. Women are trying to get the right to vote. We have the National Women's Suffrage Association, which is led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And we also have the American Women's Suffrage Association, with Henry Ward Beecher as president. Flash forward, I kind of just want you to go and read the slides that I haven't marked specifically. I believe it's useful information to know and understand the context. However, I don't think it's something you necessarily need to write down. So we did talk about Roosevelt, his big stick policy, his upbringing. And I think one of the things that I want to touch on specifically with him is how he reacted to the coal strike and how he introduced this thing called the square deal. So let's jump to slide 18, the coal strike of 1902. Soon after Roosevelt took office, some 150,000 Pennsylvania coal miners, and we did touch upon this a little bit, they went on strike for higher wages, shorter hours, and recognition of their union. Of course, we fear that the strike might not be resolved, and after a 3-month investigation, the arbitrators decided to give the workers a shorter workday, higher pay, but did not require the mining companies to recognize the union. So it's kind of like a win for the workers and a win for the business owners. This is why Roosevelt calls this a square deal. It's like, yes, give them higher wages, let them work a shorter workday, but this is something I'm just announcing right now. You still do not have to recognize their union. And of course, the union is probably the most powerful thing That's the thing that's organized to fight for the workers' rights. It's not every time that you're going to have Theodore Roosevelt or any other president at that matter stepping in and trying to create something like, anything that would help out the workers in this case. So that's why Roosevelt refers to it as a square deal. Every side is equal. And definitely read up on the square deal a little bit. We have 2 acts that regulates the railroads. Again, we're talking about how the government is really pro-business. The progressives try to go on the other road. So we have the Elkins Act, which prohibits railroads from accepting rebates and ensures that all customers pay the same rates for shipping and their products. Nobody gets any advantage here. The Hepburn Act in 1906, it strengthened the Interstate Commerce Commission, and it gave power to set maximum railroad rates. You cannot charge higher than this. We spoke a little bit last class about Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. I would definitely check to see if there's any excerpts to see how they describe the meatpacking industry. And we see on slide 21, that food producers use clever tricks to pass off tainted foods. So again, you think about today, how we know that meat has to get inspected because it might have salmonella, it might not have been, like chopped properly or whatever it might have been. There weren't regulations at this time. So you might have been someone who bought some beef that had salmonella. We didn't have the FDA to approve it. There were food producers who were using clever tricks. Dairies churned fresh milk into spoiled butter. Poultry shellers added formaldehyde, which is used to embalm dead bodies to old eggs to hide their smell. Unwary customers, they would buy this tainted food and they thought it was healthy. Drug companies were also unconcerned for customer health. Some sold medicines that didn't work. It kind of reminds me of like medieval times or like even ancient history where people would just sell like herbs and say that this was going to help you with a cough. That's how these drug companies work, kind of just out for profit. They marketed non-prescription medicines containing narcotics, and of course this leads to the Food and Drug Administration a little bit. Upton Sinclair and meatpacking. Upton Sinclair is a novelist. He exposed the wretched and unsanitary conditions at meatpacking plants in his novel The Jungle, igniting a firestorm of criticism aimed at meatpackers. We're seeing what the work of progressive writers is doing at this time. And in 1906, Roosevelt's Secretary of Agriculture, James Wilson, helped pass 2 important consumer protection laws. The Meat Inspection Act, which required federal government inspection of meat shipped across state lines, and the Pure Food and Drug Act, which outlawed food and drugs containing harmful ingredients and required that containers carry ingredient labels. It is important for the consumer to know what they are consuming. I think somebody mentioned before about like Yellowstone and Theodore Roosevelt. In the late 1800s, right, natural resources were used at an alarming rate, and foresting, plowing, polluting, and overgrazing were common. There's industry. Therefore, we are using a lot of natural resources. And when the usage is not regulated, sometimes we do use it as at an extreme point. So Roosevelt has a solution. The New Lands Reclamation Act of 1902 reflected his beliefs, and the law allowed federal government to create irrigation projects to make dry lands productive. There was also progressivism under William Howard Taft, who he helped pass the 16th Amendment. We also do know about his dollar diplomacy. This granted Congress the power to levy taxes based on individual income. And of course, progressives, they supported this. It seems like a way to pay for government programs. Also, it depends on the individual. A couple last things I want to touch on is banking reform and how there are stronger antitrust laws. President Wilson, he has this idea for banking reform in 1913 because you've seen that bank failures were common. So he wanted to create kind of like a reserve, a pool of money from which banks who were failing could be able to, pick at from. So in 1913, we created the Federal Reserve Act, created a central fund from which banks could borrow to prevent collapse during a financial panic. In regards to stronger antitrust laws, the Clayton Antitrust Act, passed in 1914, prohibited companies from buying stock in competing companies in order to form a monopoly. So this clears up the vaguity that we saw in the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Federal Trade Commission